I was born into Lebanon, which used to be the only majority Christian country in the Middle East. People don't know that. We were open-minded, we were fair, we were tolerant, we were multicultural. We prided ourselves on our multiculturalism. We had a great economy. Lebanon was Paris of the Middle East, the banking capital of the Middle East. So by the time I was born, my parents, my father was a real estate. He owned a lot of real estate. He had retired. We had a restaurant. And we lived a good life. I had a chauffeur to drive me to school. I went to private school. It was an amazing life in Lebanon then.
Here she was, this little girl, and answered a mom and dad's prayer.
Yeah.
And bombs then started dropping on your lovely home, the restaurant your daddy owned.
Yeah. Well, our life changed. Lebanon was the ideal picture of multiculturalism. It was Paris of the Middle East, because we opened our border to everybody who wanted to come to Lebanon, because we wanted to share with them the westernization which we had created in the heart of the Middle East. Muslims used to send their children to our country to get educated because we had built the best universities in the Middle East. They graduated and worked in our economy. So it was an amazing time in Lebanon. And fortunately, all that began to change as the Muslims became the majority and we became the minority, simply because of the way they multiply. I mean, we started our country as majority Christian, over 67% Christians.
Wow.
But the Muslims marry multiple wives and they have many children. While we Christians, got married, one woman for life. We have maybe 3, 4 children by a stretch. From the time our kids are born, we start thinking what school we're going to send them to, what college we're going to send them to. The Muslims, on the other hand, have many children from multiple wives. And they have 10 kids. And when you look at the end of the day, the population changed so fast, and it only took 20, 30 years. So by the 60s, when I was born into Lebanon became majority Muslim. The problem was contained until the influx of the Palestinians out of Jordan in the early 70s into Lebanon. And Lebanon was the only country to accept the third wave of Palestinian refugees, even though their Muslim brethren did not want to accept them. But we, being Christians and being, we want to help the underdog and do unto others what you want others to do unto you, and we take care of everybody. Once they came to Lebanon, they put their heads together with the Muslims in Lebanon and declared war on the Christians. And actually, the beginning of what they called the civil war in Lebanon started at a church when a Muslim radical, a Palestinian, walked into a church service on a Sunday morning and started shooting at worshipers. 4 people killed and about 100 injured. And that was the beginning of the all-out Lebanese war. And while people would call it, it's the civil war in Lebanon, the war in Lebanon was not just between, Lebanese Christians and Lebanese Muslims fighting each other. The war in Lebanon was the start of Islamists rising worldwide, coming to help the Palestinians in Lebanon, help Yasser Arafat create a base from which to fight Israel, kill the Jews, and throw them into the sea. And he was able to use Lebanese democracy, Lebanese open-mindedness, Lebanese fairness to topple our democracy. And that's how my world changed. They bombed my home in 1975. We were the last 2 Christian towns left in South Lebanon as the Muslims began advancing into the country and literally taking over military bases. I lived underneath a military base, the last military base not to be taken over by the Muslims. And so they were trying to bomb the military base, trying to take it over. And that's when the bombs fell short and ended up landing in my home. And that's when my life turned upside down. And that's how I ended up wounded, and I ended up living in a bomb shelter. We ended up living in a bomb shelter after I left the hospital with my parents. But my home, we went back home, but my home was no longer the home I left. My home was destroyed. We ended up living in a bomb shelter underground in an 8 by 10 room without electricity, without water, and very little food. We would walk under the bombs and dig out different dandelions and different vegetation that grew around our bomb shelter because it was the only greenery we had to eat. In order to get some water, we would crawl under snipers' bullets because we were surrounded by Muslim snipers shooting at us. And we would crawl under snipers' bullets to a nearby spring to get some water. And every time we left the bomb shelter, my mother and I would say our last goodbyes because we did not know if we're going to come back alive or dead, just to get a drink of water. We lived in the mountains, so it was cold in the wintertime. It would snow. It was freezing, and we didn't have any heat. And my father would walk out and break out the twigs from the trees around our bomb shelter. And we would light a fire in the bomb shelter, and my father would pour kerosene or benzene or on the bomb shelter, on the fire, and light the fire. And many nights we would huddle around the fire to warm up. And because we did not have any ventilation, we only had the door entry into the bomb shelter. Many nights we would pass out because of carbon monoxide poisoning. And we had an agreement, because there were 3 of us, my mother, my father, and I, that whoever woke up first would drag the other 2 outside and slap them on the face to wake up, because many nights we would pass out because of carbon monoxide poisoning. This became my existence. And I remember at the age of 13 years old, sitting in the bomb shelter, and we got a tip from our Christian militias who were protecting us at the time. And this is after 3 years. And after 3 years, we would listen to the news. My father would listen to the news on the radio, on a little, little transit radio on batteries, just to hear what's happening around us. And my father would say, America's going to come help the Christians. All the big Christian countries are going to wake up and see what's happening to the Christians in Lebanon, and they're going to come help the Christians. Britain is going to come help the Christians. France is going to come. Australia is going to come. And we waited, and nobody came. And when we went into our bomb shelter in the beginning, it was actually a storage room for my father's restaurant. That's where my father stored all the liquor and all the big boxes of whatever he ordered to the restaurant. And I remember for the first week, we slept in a cardboard box that my mother put a blanket over, because we thought, it's only going to be a few days. And then, of course, all these big nations are going to wake up and see the slaughter that's happening to the Christians. And of course, 2 weeks went by, 1 month went by, 2 months went by, 2 years went by, and we realized the world forgot about us. Maybe the world watched what was happening and the massacres, because the Muslims would surround the Christians. Remember, the whole war started at a church, when a Muslim walked into it and started shooting on a Sunday morning service at a church. And so the Muslims started surrounding Christian towns and slaughtering them. And, they would walk into a bomb shelter. They would find a mother and a father hiding with a baby in a bomb shelter. They would take the baby, tie one leg of the baby to the mother and another leg to the father, and pull the parents apart, splitting the child in half.
Oh my God.
They would walk into our churches. They would urinate and defecate on the altar using the Bible as toilet paper, and then torch our churches. And then, look what happened at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Remember the siege in Bethlehem? Yes. What was it, 10 years ago, when the Palestinians walked in and they just basically desecrated the church? We didn't hear any blurb out of the Vatican. We didn't hear anybody complain. Here was the birth of Christ. And this is how they treated it. They had no respect for anything holy, especially if it had to do with us. It was amazing. I remember at the age of 13, sitting in the bomb shelter, because one of our Christian militia stopped by, and he said, Brigitte, I just want you to know that tonight they're going to launch an attack against us. We heard a lot of chatter on the radio. And he said, if I don't see you tomorrow, I wish you a merciful death. And he left. And I remember sitting in my bomb shelter, sobbing, begging my mother, I don't want to die. I'm only 13 years old. And I ended up dressing in my Sunday best, my Easter dress, because I wanted to look pretty when I am dead, knowing that when they come to slaughter me, there would be no one to bury me. And I remember sobbing, begging my mother, please, I don't want to die, do something. And there was nothing she could say to me. And I remember her combing my long black hair, and she tied a white ribbon in my hair that matched the white daisies in my dress. And we sat in the corner of the shelter, and my father opened up the Bible and started reading from Psalm. I shall walk into the valley of death and fear no evil, for thou art with me. And You know, they say there are no atheists in foxholes. We ended up, my parents said to me that night, they said, when they come to slaughter us, we will create a distraction. We just want you to run towards Israel and never look back. Because you see, we lived on the border with Israel. And thank God I did not have to make that decision that night. Because that's the night when Israel came in physically into Lebanon and set up artillery bases around our town to protect us. And that's how we survived, and that's how
it's a miracle. Is that not a miracle?